My phone lit up just after 9 on Friday night. A new message in the Parker family group chat. Short enough to read in one glance, sharp enough to sting for hours. Don't come to the weekend barbecue. My new wife says you'll make the whole party stink. 2 seconds later, the reactions rolled in. Laughing emojis, thumbs up, even a heart from my parents like it was some kind of joke. I stared at the screen, let the words settle, and typed only one reply. Understood. I didn't ask why. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind them who I actually was or what I'd spent the last decade building. That's never worked with my family. Anyway, my name is Natalie Parker, 34, VP of Product at a medtech company in Austin. The kind of role people fight for, the kind of salary that pays for entire neighborhoods. But to them, I'm still the strange older sister who works too much, the one they can mock without consequence. So, I put the phone face down on my desk and went back to reviewing a contract that could change our company's year. Because when family pushes you out of the frame, there's no point begging to stay in it. You let the silence do the work. What I didn't expect was what came next. The very next morning, my assistant told me a couple was downstairs demanding to speak with whoever handled angel investments. No names, no appointment, just insistence. I said they could come up. When the elevator opened and I saw exactly who walked into my office, when they looked at me, really looked, and realized who I was, his wife actually screamed. And that scream was only the beginning. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me what time is it for you right now and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The morning moved quickly once I stepped out of the elevator and into the quiet of my floor. Weekend shifts usually felt calm. Today carried a strange tension I couldn't name. Chloe Ramirez buzzed my office before I even sat down. Her voice held a tight edge as she explained that a married couple was downstairs asking for a meeting with whoever handled angel investments. They refused to give a name, only insisted the matter was urgent. I told her to send them up. I waited in my chair, hands resting on the desk, letting the silence settle around me. People outside my family often treated these offices like shrines to ambition, intimidating in scale and glass. But I'd spent years inside these walls. Everything here was ordered, controlled, predictable. What entered through my doorway next broke that predictability clean in half. The elevator doors opened with a dull chime, and Jason Parker walked out first. His posture shifted when his eyes met mine. Surprise first, then embarrassment, then something closer to calculation. Behind him stepped Brittany Cole Parker, dressed as though she were attending an event instead of showing up unannounced at a corporate headquarters. She froze when she recognized me, and a crack of panic flickered across her expression. Neither of them expected this room. Neither of them expected me. I gave no greeting. Their presence alone carried enough noise. Jason looked around with an awe he tried to hide, while Brittany adjusted her bag with a confidence that didn't reach her eyes. She snorts, placed a glossy folder on my desk, angling it toward me with practiced ease, as if staging a presentation she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. The cover displayed a company name I'd never heard of. Something sleek and vague, designed to sound innovative without revealing anything real. I opened it just enough to see grand promises of rapid diagnostics, nationwide scalability, and projected revenue numbers that belonged in fiction. The language read like a pitch assembled from buzzwords rather than experience. Brittany began outlining her vision, but it wasn't truly a conversation. It was a performance. She spoke of timelines, market gaps, and federal pathways, none of which matched anything viable. I watched her avoid my eyes whenever she referenced financial forecasts. The entire act felt rehearsed, overly confident, underinformed, and strangely desperate. Jason stood beside her, silent, but eager, nodding at each claim as though affirming her would somehow make the plan real. I could sense how deeply he wanted me to approve whatever this was, how much he needed me to agree without thinking too carefully. His foot tapped against the floor. Small repetitive movements giving away his nerves. They wanted funding. $2 million to be precise. The numbers sat in the air like a dare, detached from the flimsy model inside their folder. I listened without interruption, letting them fill the space with assumptions about what I might do. People who underestimate you often reveal everything when you stay quiet long enough. No part of their request aligned with anything responsible, ethical, or remotely strategic. It wasn't a pitch. It was an attempt to secure a lifeline by leveraging a family tie they had spent the night mocking. The irony landed heavily, but I kept my expression neutral. The air tightened when they finished. Brittany waited for the affirmation she believed would come. Snorts. Jason seemed to brace for something softer than the truth. I did not raise my voice or lean forward. I simply declined. Not with malice, only clarity. The shift was immediate. Brittany's confidence shattered into outrage. And though her words came fast, the message beneath them was simple. She believed refusal was personal, an attack rather than a boundary. Her voice carried down the hall, sharp enough that a few engineers glanced over their monitors. Jason tried to calm her, but she pulled away with a force that left him stunned. Security appeared at the doorway, not summoned by me, but alerted by the noise. They remained professional, guiding the couple toward the elevator as Brittany's accusations escalated. I stayed seated, watching the scene unfold with a stillness I'd learned through years of being misunderstood by people who assumed I lived below them rather than above their expectations. When the doors finally closed, the office returned to its usual quiet. I fed the folder into the shredder, listening to the blade slice through the paper that had carried so many false promises. I didn't know what they planned to do next, but I had the uneasy sense that this wasn't the end of it. A quiet hour passed before the next rupture in the day surfaced. I had returned to my desk, settling into work I actually cared about, when my phone vibrated with the kind of notification no one expects on a Saturday morning. A pre-approval alert from my bank flashed across the screen. An enormous personal loan tied directly to my name. The amount was so large it didn't register at first, floating above the numbers I normally associated with personal finances. Only after a second look did I feel the familiar drop in my stomach. None of it belonged to me. None of it was even close to anything I had applied for. My pulse sharpened. I opened the details, scanning the application line by line. They had used my address, my employment information, and every piece of data necessary to push the request into automated approval. Someone knew exactly what to take and how to use it. The signature block bore a forged curve meant to mimic mine, and a second signature I recognized as Jason Parker's. The realization didn't spark anger. It brought a cold clarity I hadn't felt in years. I called the bank immediately asking to be connected to Michael Harris, the relationship manager assigned to my accounts. His professionalism studied the conversation. He pulled the application, confirmed the dual signature structure, and initiated the reversal procedure. He set a fraud flag, locked all open credit channels, and froze every potential inquiry tied to my identity. He moved efficiently, and for that I was grateful. The calm in his tone contrasted sharply with the chaos the application represented. By the time the loan had been fully terminated, my phone had started buzzing again, first in short bursts, then in longer strings that bordered on frantic. I ignored each one. I already knew the pattern. The moment accountability appeared, the narrative would flip. I braced myself, but I answered none of them. The noise could wait. A longer pause followed, and then my screen lit up with a message preview from Jason, a wall of text that blurred before I could finish reading it. Accusations, disbelief, and a tone that suggested he viewed the situation as a minor misunderstanding rather than a violation with legal weight. The next messages were shorter and harsher, dripping with entitlement. I recognized from years of being the designated responsible sibling. Brittany's number flashed after his. Her tone clipped and brittle even through text. I muted the thread, letting the silence swallow whatever came next. The building felt still by the time I stepped away from my desk and walked toward the window. I tried to focus my thoughts, but they scattered between 1,000 memories that now carried new meaning. It wasn't the loan itself that disturbed me. It was how effortlessly they had attempted to claim something that didn't belong to them. It was the certainty that they believed I would never notice or never retaliate. Their confidence had come from somewhere. The group chat, the office scene, the way they walked into my space expecting compliance. All of it formed a pattern that now made sense. They had already decided who I was in their story. The quiet one, the reliable one, the invisible one. People like that expect you to absorb impact without flinching. I refused to accept that role anymore. By midday, I closed my laptop and prepared to leave the office. My mind sifted through logistics, contingencies, and the tightening puzzle of motives. I needed information they didn't want me to have, truths buried beneath polished performances and borrowed charm. I had no intention of confronting them without evidence. The sun had begun to dip by the time I reached my front door. A single envelope lay on the ground, centered neatly against the frame. No return address, no markings, just my name typed in plain font. Its weight suggested more than a letter. Something deliberate waited inside. I picked it up and stepped into my living room, setting my bag aside before opening the envelope. A thick stack of documents slid into my hand, secured by a metal clip. Court filings, loan summaries, screenshots, and names I recognized only through fragments of what I'd heard about Brittany's life before Jason. It took only a few pages to understand this wasn't random. It was a dossier, and it held answers I hadn't known I was missing. The pages in the envelope felt heavier with each one I turned, as if the weight came not from paper, but from the truth it carried. I moved through them slowly, absorbing the pattern beneath the chaos. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't Brittany's first attempt at financial reinvention, nor her first time securing stability through someone else's resources. Her past unfolded in a sequence of official filings and dated statements, delinquent accounts, credit extensions, abruptures, and a collapse traced through a single name, Tyler Grant. He appeared first in bankruptcy petitions, then in loan documents bearing his signature next to hers, and later in records showing sharp declines in assets that once belonged solely to him. The paper trail revealed a systematic extraction, one that mirrored what she had attempted through Jason. I paused, letting the pattern sink in. It explained her confidence, the practiced certainty in her pitch, the entitlement in her demands. This wasn't improvisation. It was repetition. The investigator responsible for the dossier had included a contact number for Tyler along with a brief notation that he was willing to speak if approached directly. I didn't overthink it. I dialed. When he answered, his tone carried the exhaustion of someone who had already lived the version of my story I was stepping into. I introduced myself, explained that I had come across documents connected to him, and asked if he was willing to confirm a few details. His silence stretched just long enough for me to understand how difficult the request was, but he eventually agreed. Tyler didn't provide a narrative. Instead, he named specific events, financial commitments made under pressure, credit lines opened in his name, promises that evaporated once balances shifted beyond recovery. His words were measured, stripped of bitterness, but the impact of what he survived lingered in each pause. I didn't interrupt. I only listened. By the time the call ended, the threads between his past and my present formed a clear structure. Brittany's behavior wasn't impulsive. It was patterned. My anger didn't flare. Clarity did. There was no way to address this without dismantling every access point she had leveraged. I opened my laptop again, pulling up property records I hadn't viewed in years. The house Jason lived in with Brittany appeared with a familiar listing. My name alone attached to the deed, my accounts tied to the mortgage, my signatures authorizing every financial line associated with the property. I had purchased it years earlier to give Jason stability during a period when he was still trying to find his direction. I had never imagined that gift would become a shield for someone determined to exploit him. I moved through the digital records carefully, confirming each connection. The situation was larger than a fraudulent loan attempt. It involved every structure of support I had placed around my brother. It required a decisive response, one governed not by emotion, but by precision. I called Angela Price, my attorney, and explained that I needed immediate action on 3 fronts: termination of support, formal notice to vacate, and comprehensive protection of my financial identity. Angela listened carefully, taking notes without interrupting. She asked specific questions, assessing liability, timelines, and jurisdiction. Her tone never shifted, but I could sense her concern through the measured cadence of her voice. She drafted the documents while we remained on the call. A termination letter outlining the cutoff of all direct and indirect support. A notice giving 30 days to vacate the property. Additional protections involving the freeze and monitoring of all legal and financial activity tied to my name. Snorts. She promised to send finalized copies within the hour. With each step, a sense of order returned. Not comfort, just structure. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. I felt prepared. After the call ended, I remained seated, looking at the scattered pages on my table. The dossier had arrived without explanation, but its intention was unmistakable. Someone wanted me to see the truth before it buried Jason further. Whether it came from concern or obligation didn't matter. The information existed, and now I had to act on it. I gathered the documents into a single stack and placed them beside my laptop, ready for whatever came next. The day had turned long and quiet, but the path forward held no ambiguity. Everything that needed to be done had become unmistakably clear. By late afternoon, the decisions I had made settled into something firm enough to move on. I drove toward the house where Jason lived, tracing a route I'd taken hundreds of times before, though never with intentions like these. The neighborhood was quiet when I arrived, the kind of stillness that magnifies every small sound. Tyler Grant was already waiting near the sidewalk, standing with the kind of composure that comes from having nothing left to lose. He nodded once when I stepped out, and we walked to the front door together without speaking. Jason opened it before I could knock. His expression shifted from confusion to weariness the moment he saw Tyler standing behind me. He stepped back instinctively, as if the presence of a past he didn't understand had knocked the air out of him. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked past him into the living room, setting my folder on the coffee table with a deliberate calm that cut through the space. Brittany emerged from the hallway, her confidence faltering when she recognized Tyler. The reaction was instantaneous, shock pressing into something closer to fear. She froze mid-step, the practiced charm she usually carried falling away in pieces. I sat down and opened the folder, spreading the documents across the table in neat, unwavering lines. Tyler placed a separate set of pages beside mine, records he had brought as confirmation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of what lay between us spoke loud enough. Jason stood across from me, hands trembling slightly as his eyes moved from one page to another. Confusion tightened into disbelief, and disbelief into something darker as the pattern revealed itself. I watched the moment he realized the shape of what he had been living inside. Brittany's reaction came slower. She scanned the papers, then lifted her chin as if defiance alone could erase the evidence. Her stare flicked between Tyler and me with a sharpness that searched for a weak point to exploit. She found none. I didn't offer commentary. I allowed silence to fill the room, letting the truth settle exactly where it needed to. Jason leaned closer, tracing signatures that made his face drain of color. He looked at Tyler, then at me, uncertain which question to ask first. My voice broke the silence only when it was necessary. I explained the structure of the debts, the overlapping loan attempts, the forged elements, and the timeline that showed how each event aligned with Brittany's arrival in his life. My tone remained steady, not cold, just controlled. He needed clarity, not emotion. While he absorbed the information, Brittany shifted into a defensive posture, not loud, but sharp, aiming to redirect fault rather than address the truth. She dismissed the documents as outdated, misinterpreted, irrelevant. She insisted that Tyler held grudges, that I was overreacting, that her intentions had been misunderstood. Her words didn't match the evidence. Jason knew it, and the brief flicker of denial on his face collapsed into resignation. I reached into my bag and placed 2 final papers on the table, one terminating all financial support, the other announcing the 30-day deadline to vacate the property. Both documents bore the signatures required. The clarity in them left no room for negotiation. Jason stared at the notices, the air catching in his throat. Not anger, something closer to grief. He sank onto the couch slowly, as if the weight of the past day had finally landed in full. The silence around him felt heavy, but not unexpected. Brittany stepped forward with a burst of indignation, protesting the legality, the timing, the audacity. Yet the arguments carried more desperation than conviction. The walls she relied on had begun to collapse, and she knew it. I rose from my seat, gathering the remaining documents. The conversation had reached its natural end. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain. Jason's eyes lifted toward me, hollowed by shock, searching for a lifeline I could no longer give. I didn't offer one. Without another word, I stepped toward the door, Tyler following behind me as quietly as he had arrived. The house held its silence as we left, absorbing the impact of everything that had been laid bare. Once outside, the air felt colder. Not cleansing, just honest. And honesty was all that remained. The next day carried a strange stillness as I pulled into my parents' driveway. A stillness that felt at odds with the noise gathering in the backyard. Voices rose in loose clusters, relaxed, cheerful, unaware of the unraveling that waited behind the gate. I stepped out of my car with the folder tucked firmly under my arm and walked toward the sound of clinking glasses and shifting conversations. No one noticed me at first. My family had always been good at folding themselves into celebrations, even when tension lingered beneath the surface. Grandma June Parker stood near the grill, watching the scene with a quiet attentiveness I recognized. She saw me before anyone else, her expression shifting just slightly, as if she understood what was coming long before it arrived. I walked past all of them without pausing. The long picnic table in the center of the yard was covered in patterned cloth, weighed down by bowls of food and half-finished plates. I cleared a narrow space near the center and set my folder down, opening it with the same deliberate calm I had used the night before. The conversation around me faltered, plates stilled, chairs stopped creaking. The sound of the grill faded into the background as eyes turned toward the papers I laid out in a clean, unbroken line. Mortgage records, loan summaries, investigative documents, bankruptcy filings, a pattern no one in this yard could argue with. Brittany appeared beside my father, her movements overly casual, a smile stretched thin across her face as she directed attention away from the table. Jason trailed behind her, his posture tense, his expression already tight with dread. He reached the edge of the table, saw the first page, and froze. The silence tightened around us. My mother stepped forward, confusion flickering across her features as she looked from Jason to me and then to the document spread before her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. The answer sat clearly on the table. Brittany's composure cracked. Not dramatically at first, just a small shift, a tightening of her jaw, the flick of her eyes scanning each page too quickly. She reached for one of the documents, but my father stopped her with a hand on her wrist, his face pale in a way I had rarely seen. Jason sank onto the bench, shoulders folding inward as he stared at the signatures that belonged to Brittany and to another man, a man he had never met, but whose life now mirrored the path Jason had unknowingly stepped onto. The realization carved through him with a quiet devastation. I didn't speak immediately. There was no need to narrate what was already evident. I simply let the truth sit in the open air, free from the shadows where it had been hiding. My mother finally broke the silence, her voice soft, strained, and trembling around the edges. She asked how this had happened, how deep the damage went, what any of us were supposed to do next. I answered only what was necessary. Facts stripped of emotion, decisions already made, boundaries already set. Brittany attempted a defense, then sharper than the one she delivered at Jason's house, layered with accusations meant to redirect blame. But her words carried no force in front of tangible evidence. Her tone shifted from indignation to desperation and finally to hostility when she realized no one in the yard was stepping forward to shield her. Jason covered his face with both hands. For a long moment, he didn't move. Through it all, Grandma June stepped closer, her gaze steady, her voice calm when she finally spoke. She didn't address me first. She addressed the family, reminding them of the responsibility they carried, the patterns they had ignored, the harm that grew when silence was easier than confrontation. Her words didn't scold, they clarified. And in that clarity, the weight shifted off me and onto the truth itself. When she finished, the yard remained quiet, subdued by a truth too large to dismiss. I gathered the documents, placing them back into the folder with slow precision. No one tried to stop me. No one attempted to reshape the narrative. Even Brittany's protests had faded into scattered breaths. I walked toward the gate without looking back. The only sound behind me was the low hum of the grill and the realization settling across the yard like a heavy, undeniable fog. I didn't stay for a plate. I didn't stay for an apology. I simply left. The air outside the yard felt colder as the gate clicked shut behind me. The quiet that followed unfolded slowly, the kind that takes time to recognize because it replaces chaos 1 inch at a time. I adjusted to it without realizing I was doing it. Days felt lighter. Nights stopped vibrating with missed calls. And my thoughts finally moved at a normal rhythm instead of reacting to whatever had erupted next. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. Everything shifted in controlled pieces, the way real consequences usually do. The legal processes around the house finished first. Paperwork that had once been buried under emotional noise became straightforward documents with signatures and clear outcomes. The property returned to my name with no resistance. Once the 30-day period ended, the house emptied out in a way that felt almost ceremonial. No accusations, no final confrontations, just a space reverting to its original state. I drove by only once. The porch light was off. The yard silent, the windows dark. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was relief. Clean and uncomplicated. Brittany Cole Parker entered her own spiral. Next, creditors traced her patterns with unsettling accuracy, pulling forward old debts she had deferred and new ones she had disguised beneath their brief months of marriage. Each notice carried a reminder of her choices, and each deadline arrived with a consequence she could no longer shift onto someone else. I didn't intervene. Nothing I could do would replace the accountability she had worked so hard to outrun. She snorts, had relied on charm and pressure for years. Neither worked anymore. Jason Parker, removed from her orbit, began a different kind of descent, one that looked more like recalibration than collapse. He found a small apartment near an old industrial strip on the edge of town. People who still spoke with my parents mentioned he spent long hours at a mechanic shop that didn't ask questions beyond whether he could show up on time and do the work. His voice, they said, had lost its defensiveness. He stopped explaining, stopped complaining, stopped insisting he had been misunderstood. He just worked quietly in a way he hadn't in a long time. My parents hovered in a space between regret and uncertainty. Their messages softened, their tone shifted from scolding to tentative, and their assumptions quieted. I let time filter their words before responding. They didn't need explanations. They needed distance long enough to understand that silence sometimes communicates what conversations cannot. It was Grandma June Parker who cut through all of it. She sent a handwritten note with her familiar looping script telling me she made a pot of coffee every morning at 7 and would like company if I had time. There was no emotional bargaining, no plea for reconciliation, just an open door from a woman whose steadiness had anchored every major storm in our family. I went. The cafe she chose sat beside an aging bookstore and smelled like old paper and warm cinnamon. She was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a mug as though absorbing its warmth. She asked nothing about the house, the legal notices, or the fractured threads between us. Instead, she talked about the garden she had replanted, the neighbor who kept borrowing her tools, and the way quiet can tell the truth better than conversations full of noise. Only near the end did she mention Jason. She said he wanted to speak to me, but refused to interrupt my peace until I was ready. I didn't promise anything that morning, but by afternoon I messaged him. Not a long explanation, just a time and a place. He arrived early and waited on the bench outside a small community center, where the parking lot always smelled faintly of pine from the row of old trees along the back fence. His posture was smaller than I remembered, not weakened, just honest. He didn't attempt a greeting. He let the moment settle before speaking quietly. There was no performance in his voice. The apology was plain, stripped of excuses. He acknowledged every decision he had let stand, every doubt he had allowed to replace trust, and every line he had crossed without stopping to see who he was hurting. I listened. I didn't soften immediately. Forgiveness without reflection is only permission disguised as kindness, and I wasn't offering that. But I allowed something to shift. I told him I accepted the apology, not because the past didn't matter, but because accountability had finally arrived without being dragged. The space between us didn't fill with warmth, but it loosened enough to breathe. He nodded, understanding more than I said aloud, and when we parted, the distance felt measured instead of fractured. Some relationships don't return to what they were. They become something quieter, steadier, and more deliberate. A few more weeks passed before the final weight lifted. I realized I didn't replay the arguments anymore. Didn't analyze every message. Didn't brace for the next crisis. The past had settled into its place. Not rewritten, not erased, simply finished. The lesson wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're instructions for how others must treat us if they want to stay in our lives. Consequences aren't revenge. They're clarity. And forgiveness isn't a surrender. It's choosing to stop carrying the weight that belongs to someone else. If you stayed through this entire journey, thank you. Stories like this don't travel because they're dramatic. They travel because someone listening needs the reminder that protecting yourself is not cruelty. It's wisdom. And if a part of this resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far this story reached.